May the 29th, 1453. The greatest cannon the world has ever seen roars outside the walls of Constantinople, and the last Roman emperor throws off his imperial regalia and charges into the fighting to die as an ordinary soldier. His name is Constantine XI, and after this day, no one will ever wear his title again. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, just 21 years old, rides into the fallen city in triumph, and history records it as one of the great turning points of the world. Fall of Constantinople, the end of the Roman Empire, more than 1,000 years after Rome itself. And the story is usually told like this: a brilliant young conqueror, a monstrous new cannon, mighty walls smashed, a city taken. But that story hides the real one, because Constantinople did not truly fall in 1453. By the time Mehmed's cannon fired, the greatest city of the medieval world was already a corpse, waiting for the final blow. Its true destruction had begun 2.5 centuries earlier, and the people who first bled it dry were not the Ottomans at all. They were fellow Christians. This is the true origin of the fall of Constantinople. To understand how far the city had fallen, you first have to understand what it once was. For most of the Middle Ages, Constantinople was the greatest city in the Christian world, and one of the greatest cities on earth. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire, which had continued for 1,000 years after the western half collapsed. At its height, Constantinople may have held around 500,000 people, an almost unimaginable number for the medieval world. It was fabulously wealthy, a center of trade where the riches of Europe and Asia flowed together. It was a treasure house of art, learning, and relics. And it was protected by the most formidable fortifications ever built, the Great Theodosian Walls, a triple line of defenses that had turned away enemy after enemy for 1,000 years. For a millennium, this city stood as the shield of the Christian East, guarding the frontier of Europe against invasion after invasion. So how does a city like that end up, by 1453, as a hollow shell of fewer than 50,000 people, its treasury empty, its walls crumbling its guard, and its allies indifferent to its fate? Did not happen over centuries, and it began with a catastrophic military defeat. In the year 1071, at a place called Manzikert, the Byzantine army was shattered by the Seljuk Turks. The emperor was captured, the army destroyed, and in the aftermath, the empire lost control of Anatolia, its heartland. This was the region that had supplied the empire with most of its soldiers, its food, and its taxes. Losing it was a wound from which the empire never truly recovered. Its manpower shrank. Its revenue shrank. It became, from that point on, a smaller and more fragile state, increasingly dependent on others for its survival. But Manzikert, terrible as it was, did not kill the empire. The blow that truly broke its back came more than a century later, and it came from the people who were supposed to be its allies. In 1204, an army of Western European crusaders arrived at Constantinople. This was the Fourth Crusade, and it had set out, supposedly, to fight in the Holy Land. But through a tangled series of debts, broken bargains, and ambitions, that crusade was diverted. Instead of marching against distant enemies, these Christian crusaders turned on the greatest Christian city in the world. They attacked Constantinople. They breached its defenses. And then they did something that shocked even the medieval world. They sacked the city with horrifying brutality. For 3 days, the crusaders looted, burned, and destroyed. They stripped the churches of their treasures. They melted down priceless works of art for their metal. They stole the sacred relics that were the spiritual heart of the Eastern Christian world and carried them off to the West, where some can still be found in European churches today. The accumulated wealth of centuries, the artistic and religious treasure of the greatest city in Christendom, was plundered in an orgy of greed and violence by fellow Christians. This was the true death blow. Understand what it did. Economically, it gutted the city, stealing the wealth that had made it great and that could never be fully replaced. Politically, it shattered the empire. For decades after 1204, there was not even a Byzantine empire in Constantinople at all, but a foreign crusader regime, while Byzantine successor states survived in exile. The Byzantines eventually recaptured their city in 1261, but the empire they restored was a pale shadow, poor, fractured, and permanently weakened. The unity and legitimacy of the old empire had been broken beyond repair. The deep Bitter hatred, the sack created between Eastern and Western Christians, would poison relations for the centuries to come, and would cripple the empire's ability to get help when it needed it most. So by the time the Ottomans became a serious threat, Constantinople was already a wounded, impoverished, and isolated city, betrayed by the very Christian West it had shielded for so long. And then the Byzantines did something that helped seal their own doom. They invited the enemy in. In the 14th century, the shrunken Byzantine Empire was torn apart by its own civil wars, as rival claimants fought bitterly for the throne. And in these desperate power struggles, Byzantine factions did something catastrophic. They hired Ottoman warriors as mercenaries, bringing them across into Europe to fight in their internal conflicts. It seemed clever at the time, using foreign soldiers to win a domestic war. But it was a fatal mistake, because the Ottomans, once invited into Europe, saw exactly how weak and divided the Byzantines had become. And they did not leave. They gained their first permanent foothold on the European continent, and from there they began to expand. Over the following decades, the Ottomans conquered the lands around Constantinople, one region after another, until the once mighty empire was reduced to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. Constantinople became an island of Byzantium in an Ottoman sea, completely surrounded, cut off, its fate now only a matter of time. The Byzantines had helped build the very power that would consume them. And in these final desperate decades, the Byzantine emperors did everything they could to find salvation. Again and again, they appealed to the Christian West for military aid, sending desperate pleas to the Pope, to the kings of Europe, begging for armies to come and save the last remnant of the Roman Empire and the Eastern shield of Christendom. But the help never truly came, and part of the reason was a bitter religious dispute. For centuries, the Christianity of the East and the Christianity of the West had been divided, split over authority and doctrine. The West made its price for help clear. If the Byzantines wanted Western military aid, their church would have to submit to Rome, to accept union on Western terms. And this tore the Byzantines apart from within. Some emperors agreed to church union in desperation, hoping it would unlock Western armies. But many of their own people bitterly rejected it, seeing it as a betrayal of their faith and their identity, still remembering the horror of 1204. There is a famous, bitter saying that captured the mood among some in the city, that they would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than the Latin bishop's hat. That was how deep the wound of Western betrayal ran. So the church union, meant to bring salvation, instead brought division, and it never delivered the great army the Byzantines needed. At the critical moment, Byzantine diplomacy was paralyzed by a theological dispute, and the West, distracted by its own affairs and unmoved by the fate of a city it had once plundered, largely stood aside. And so we come to the final act, and to the young Sultan and his terrible cannon. Mehmed II was determined to take Constantinople and make it his own, and to smash the legendary walls that had held for 1,000 years. He turned to news technology, gunpowder, massive cannon. And here is a detail that captures the whole tragedy of Byzantine weakness. The man who built the greatest of these cannons was a Hungarian engineer named Orban, and according to the traditional account, Orban did not go to the Ottomans first. He offered his services and his monstrous cannon to the Byzantine emperor first, but the emperor could not afford him. The Byzantine treasury, drained by centuries of decline in the plunder of 1204, simply did not have the money to pay for the weapon or the materials to build it. So Orban took his talents to the Sultan, who had the wealth to pay him handsomely. And Orban built for Mehmed an enormous cannon, a gun so large it could hurl a massive stone ball and, over time, batter the ancient walls. Think about that. The very weapon that would help break Constantinople had first been offered to its defenders, who were too poor to buy it. The city's poverty, the legacy of its long bleeding, armed its own executioner. In the spring of 1453, Mehmed brought his great army and his great guns to the walls of Constantinople. Inside the city, the defenders were pitifully few. Against an Ottoman army of tens of thousands, the Emperor Constantine XI could muster only a small force, perhaps several thousand of his own men, aided by a few brave contingents of Western volunteers. Most famously, a group of Genoese soldiers who came to fight and die for the city, even as their governments largely stayed away. The odds were hopeless. For weeks, the great cannon pounded the ancient walls, and the defenders desperately repaired the breaches by night, as fast as they were smashed by day. They fought with astonishing courage, holding off assault after assault against overwhelming numbers. But there were simply too few of them, and too many of the enemy. And here we should clear away one famous myth. The story is often told that the city fell because someone forgot to lock a small gate called the Kerkoporta, letting the Ottomans slip inside. It is a neat, dramatic tale of a single careless mistake, dooming an empire. But historians regard this as, at best, a minor and uncertain detail, not the true cause. Constantinople did not fall because of one unlocked gate. It fell because a tiny, exhausted garrison, defending miles of wall against a vast army with overwhelming firepower, simply could not hold forever. In the early hours of May the 29th, 1453, the final great assault came. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the battered walls. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, were finally overwhelmed. The Ottomans broke through, and the Emperor Constantine, seeing that all was lost, is said to have cast aside the marks of his rank and charged into the enemy to meet his end fighting, his body never identified among the fallen. The city was taken. After more than 1,000 years, the Roman Empire, in its final Byzantine form, had come to an end. Mehmed, just 21, rode into the ancient city as its conqueror, and Constantinople would become the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the city we now know as Istanbul. So look back at the whole long story and ask the real question. Was Constantinople conquered from the outside in 1453, or did it collapse from within, long before the Ottoman fleet ever appeared? The honest answer is that the siege of 1453 was not the cause of the fall. It was the final scene of a death that had been unfolding for 2.5 centuries. The wound of Manzikert in 1071. The catastrophic betrayal and plunder by fellow Christians in 1204, which shattered the city's wealth and legitimacy. The self-destructive civil wars that invited the Ottomans into Europe. The religious divisions and Western indifference that left the city to face its end alone. By 1453, Constantinople was a city of fewer than 50,000 souls rattling around, inside walls built for 500,000, a hollow monument to a vanished greatness, too poor to buy the cannon that would destroy it, too isolated to summon the allies who might have saved it. Mehmed did not so much conquer a living empire as bury a dying one, and that is the lesson that echoes far beyond this single city. Empires rarely die from a single blow. They are hollowed out slowly, from within by their own divisions, their own betrayals, their own short-sighted choices, until they are so weak that when the final enemy finally arrives, all that remains is to push over a structure that has already rotted from the inside. The cannon and the young conqueror make for a dramatic ending. But the real story of how Constantinople fell was written centuries before by the friends who plundered it, and the empire that tore it itself long before any enemy stood at the gate. Which leaves a genuinely difficult question, and I want to know where you land on it. Do you think Constantinople could have survived if only different choices had been made, if the West had never sacked it in 1204, or had come to its aid in 1453? Or was its fall inevitable, long before that final morning, written into centuries of decline that no last stand could reverse? Tell me in the comments what you think, because historians still argue over this fiercely, and I do not believe there is a simple answer. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it.